Hello and welcome to episode 21 of Radio Europa. I'm your host, Will from England, and joining me today are Boris from Croatia and Darth from Scotland. Hi, guys.
Hello. Hello.
Today, we've got a bit of a special episode because, as you'll all know, next Sunday is the 100th anniversary of the end of World War One. So we're going to discuss a few things related to that. Just before we begin, just to let you know, guys, you can catch all of our previous episodes on YouTube and SoundCloud. And if you want to donate to help us keep doing what we do and you like our work, then the links are at the bottom. So I'm just going to get straight into the topic because there's loads we could talk about, but we've narrowed it down to a few things that we think are particularly important. First of all is the role of multiculturalism in the start of the war and how that was the cause of the war. As you'll know, it began as a sort of semi-internal dispute of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So, Boris, is part of Croatia's history, so I want to come to you first on that. Basically, the question I've got is, to what extent did multiculturalism and diversity within an empire contribute to the outbreak of the war?
Yeah, well, we've got to remember that the start, sort of the initiation of the war, happened with the assassination of our Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And it was done by a Serbian nationalist called Gavrilo Princip, and he was part of an organization called Crna Ruka, or Black Hand in English for the Anglos. So it happened in Sarajevo, which is the current capital of BiH, Bosnia and Herzegovina. And in that name, you already see that there's a problem with it. Most countries in the world only have one name. Bosnia and Herzegovina is special there. And basically, the reason for the assassination of the Archduke was that the Serbs and the Bosnians at that time, all of that territory, Bosnia and Herzegovina today, that was part of Austro-Hungary. And Austro-Hungary, apart from that, had a lot of other ethnic groups. But what happened there, these two groups, they were unhappy with being ruled by two completely different ethnic groups from up north of Europe. And so they, radicals hatched a plan to try and secede. And don't you know it, in the end, that actually occurred. And the way we can join these two old topics this is a topic from a century ago. The way we can join it is the empire was very multicultural. It had two main groups, Austrians and Hungarians, obviously. But there were Croats, there were Slovenes, there were Serbs, there were Bosniaks, and there were some others. And these groups did not get along with each other. Even the groups that were ethnically related, the South Slavs, they didn't get along with each other because of cultural differences, mostly religious, but there were also just cultural differences in general. This tore a giant empire apart, which had existed for, don't quote me on this, but some 400 to 500 years. It was completely destroyed during the war and especially after it, with all the groups sort of clashing apart. And we see these same things occur. The embers are starting to get flame. We see the same things happening in mostly the West. So when I say that, I mean Canada, America, and especially Western Europe. Less so in the east of Europe, but it's coming there too. So Britain, its capital, it's no longer majority white. Cologne and Frankfurt in Germany, no longer majority German. And, there's a reason they say history is the teacher. And that reason is that everything is cyclical, and the conflicts that happened a century ago will only be worse this time around, because this time around, it's not ethnic groups, it's racially different groups. So even more alien to each other. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think on that point as well, so the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand by the Serbian nationalists was essentially, and because this has relevance today, because it was essentially born out of frustration that the Serbian people were lacking self-determination. They weren't allowed to govern
themselves, yes.
Yeah, govern themselves by and for their own people. And I think you do see some of that in the European Union today, that one of the big frustrations with it is that people are not able to govern themselves under the principle of self-government. So, you can see, obviously terrorism is not a good thing, but you can see how frustrations that may seem minor and from a small country and not important, you can see how they can spill over, and like they did 100 years ago or 104 years ago, into a global conflict. Darth, have you got anything to add about the multicultural element of it? Because it's a very fascinating point, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely so. One thing I was thinking about when Boris was talking was, the Balkans had been released effectively from the Ottoman Empire not long before the outbreak of World War I. So they had gone basically from one multicultural area or empire to another multicultural empire. So, they have been, battered from pillar to post in the sense of ideologies and ethnic groups being forced to live next to each other. But to pick back up on what you were saying about the European Union, I think that's clearly obvious. These are issues that have not gone away and are becoming more and more of an issue today. And I think it's, you've got arguments being made of, well, we don't need borders because, money crosses borders. Money is ultimately the thing that makes the world go round. And yes, to a certain extent it is, but I think it's blatantly obvious as to why we have borders and why they're important. Because when you have people who are advocating that, anybody can live in one country and it doesn't matter where you come from, once you come to our country, you are a citizen of this country, people seem to narrow-mindedly assume that you will automatically adopt the values of the country that you move into, but that's been proven time and time again to not work. So when you've got Germany advocating, saying, we need people from Africa, for example, to be our new Germans. Well, I'm sorry, it doesn't matter what race you're from. If you have a culture that's completely alien to the German people, they're going to bring that culture here, and they're not going to change just because they've moved into Germany. So that's obviously what was going on in Austria-Hungary. You have multiple different languages being spoken, and I think that's one of the core values that makes a country is if you have a unifying language, that's something that everybody can share as a common value. And if you're now having, like, for example, in London, I don't know how many languages are spoken in London, but for example, the police now need to have more than one language before they can join in the Met. So that shows that the language is being thrown out as an entity that joins everybody. So I think, these values are very quickly being thrown out in the name of globalism and borderless countries. And I think this is going to be something that could spark another war. And it shows that we clearly haven't learnt from World War I.
Yeah, I think you're right. And what you end up with is a situation where actually nobody has self-determination, because if you throw different cultures and races and languages into a melting pot, then actually you end up in a position where rather than everybody benefits, everybody loses. But just when you mentioned Germany, it made me think of a comparison. So with the First War, I think it's common knowledge today that, and it's a bit of a boomer meme, but it's pretty true that that Germany is the major power player in the European Union, and most decisions don't get taken unless they go past Angela Merkel's desk. Do you guys think that there's a parallel to be drawn between the resentment felt by, say, Serbian nationalists against the Habsburgs in 1914 and the resentment felt by smaller countries like Greece, Hungary, and maybe some of the other Mediterranean countries against Angela Merkel and the German machine, which seems to financially dominate the European stage?
Yeah, definitely. A parallel I can draw here is even during the time of Yugoslavia, when the South Slavs tried a unified project, the problem was almost exactly the same as the European Union. One of the big problems, yeah, not the problem, was almost the same as this one right now. So Slovenia and Croatia were the two most economically powerful nations, and the others just felt like they were lacking behind, felt like they were used, felt like those two were dominating the whole country, and the resentment from that's one part, and there were other parts. The resentment from that caused a breakup, caused the largest war since the end of the Second War, many atrocities, and stuff like that is felt in the European Union today, definitely.
And on the back of that, I would totally agree. I mean, that when William was asking the question, the point that jumped out to me straight away was when Greece was going through its effectively the bankruptcy of its country, and it was told to undertake massive reorganization of its government so that it wouldn't collapse because they were threatening to drop out of the European Union, and they had to, change their taxes and etc. etc. And you could see there was massive amounts of unhappiness from the Greek people, and it was basically, Germany was the main push behind those advocating changes. And I think that it's clearly obvious that in society there is always a hierarchy develops, and it's blatantly obvious that Germany is at the top of the hierarchy of the European Union, regardless of whether there is a quote-unquote democracy of countries. It seems that there are one or two countries who are effectively deciding what the other countries will and will not do. For example, what's going on in the Eastern European countries, where Viktor Orban, for example, is refusing to take his quota of migrants because he doesn't believe in the movement of migrants into his country just because the European Union has told them to.
Definitely.
Yeah, I think... Sorry, Boris.
Sure, you go on.
I was just going to say, I do think that, there's many parallels on that debate to be drawn from then to now, because it is just like that again, and economic power talks. It's an inescapable fact that if a country is economically dominant or politically dominant, then it's going to have ramifications on the rest of the project. Just following on from that, obviously today you mentioned Viktor Orban, and we can see there is a lot of resentment against the European Union, which is translating into election victories for more nationalistic-minded people. You've got that in Italy, Poland, Austria, Hungary, and many other countries. However, to play devil's advocate, there's a case to be made to say that nationalism or excessive nationalism contributed towards World War I and the death and bloodshed that we saw in that war. Boris, do you think it's possible for modern governments to strike a balance between healthy self-determination nationalism on the one hand, but also avoiding the disputes and diplomatic insults and whatnot that are often caused by chauvinistic nationalism, like we saw at the beginning of the 20th century?
I do, definitely. And parallels I can draw is, for example, whenever in history, whenever there was a multicultural project, let's call it, so an empire, whenever that happened, and what would happen always would be that the dominant groups in that empire, the most powerful ones, either economically or militarily, they would be the ones calling the shots, obviously. A hierarchy develops. And whenever it was sort of a confederate status, so if the other groups had some measure of autonomy, if it wasn't just an empire, the problem always that would arise is that the strongest groups would want to pursue their interests, and the smaller groups would have no say in matters because they were simply too weak, not powerful enough economically or militarily for the others to take them seriously or to take their interest into account. And currently, that is, I would say, the case with the EU. Another parallel would be right now what's happening in just the EU, talking about the EU, not Europe now. The Eastern European EU members, they are actually more Europhile, so they like the idea of the European Union. Currently, they like it more than the Southern members and even the Western members because the Eastern members they benefit economically from the Union. Poland is an incredible example where I think for the last 30 years, maybe even longer, maybe shorter, I'm not quite sure, but they've had their GDP, their economy, GDP per capita, everything has risen and gotten better steadily. Just an increase in wealth and prosperity every year, year on year. So they're benefiting. And the others, not so much. Brexit happened because of that, because because Britain isn't benefiting economically as much, especially the borders question. And another problem is that the southern states in general are poor and have weaker economies than the northern states. So it's always it goes back to what Darth said, that it always revolves around money.
I think that's true. And on the point of Brexit, obviously you're right. The big motivating factor of that is that the British taxpayer is paying in money, not seeing any benefit, but also not only that, they're not getting the decision as to where the money is spent, and then they're having other key decisions taken away from them, like borders. So it always comes back to this issue of self-determination, the same issue that sparked the first war. I just want to, I think we've done that bit pretty nicely. I just want to move on to something we were going to talk about, which was learning the lessons of the war. I think that it also ties in nicely to what we should learn, such as a sort of civil war between European countries is obviously not a good thing and should be averted, but also where our leaders haven't learned the lessons. So either of you, we'll start on the first point on I guess it's what people call the brother wars dilemma. Just how important is it that we avoid these intra-European wars in the future?
Well, I mean, I think, you had an entire generation of specifically men killed in World War One and later on World War Two. So you had the wiping out of entire gene pools at the expense of pretty much nothing, or for the gain of pretty much nothing. But the Europe has suffered greatly because of both wars, more so than many other countries. But when you have to say that Europe is at risk of disappearing culturally because of what is going on right now with mass migration, and I guess laterally the movement of Islam. You have what we would identify as European countries, in the 20th century being quickly eroded in the name of multiculturalism and globalism. So I think there's very much a romanticism of the 20th century, even though there was, it was the bloodiest century probably in history. I think in the West there's very much a romanticism about that time period, and I think it's because it was when our nationalities, our identities were at their strongest. What it was to be British, what it was to be German, what it was to be Italian, etc. They were very much able to identify, what it meant to be from that country. And I think we're very much beginning to lose that sense of identity because people are saying, well, what does it matter? It doesn't matter whether you identify as British or not, because ultimately, if you move to Britain, you're therefore British. And I think, we're very much losing that sense of identity, and it's something to be proud of. I mean, I think probably one of the best examples of that was the USA. Look how patriotic they were, or they are. They have their flag, they're proud of it. They have their national anthem. They look to it all the time, and we in Europe seem to have this increasing embarrassment of we shouldn't be proud of our country, and I think that is something that we really must protect.
Yeah, and I think the period that most people romanticize, like you said, I might be wrong, but the impression I get is, especially when you watch the period dramas in the UK, is that it's the immediate post-war period. So not 1945, but 1950 to 1965, before the mass migration and the ethnic masochism started. But you're right. I think you're right that on the point of mass migration and the loss of identity, we risk inflaming frustrations which are innate in the human soul, which is the desire for self-determination. And Boris, this is maybe an on-the-spot question, but on the second point of this topic, do you think by pursuing the policies of mass migration and importing hostile elements into the continent, the current crop of leaders risk ignoring history and blowing up Europe again?
Absolutely. The one thing that I have felt as a huge frustration ever since 2015, ever since the migrant crisis, and I have no doubt, I've talked to some of my friends and who know these subjects deeply, and a general frustration that's felt in the Balkans overall, the Balkan Peninsula, the people there here, is that if you look back at history, the Balkan Peninsula was almost always the point of contact between Europe and Asia. And always in the Balkans, and Poland too, always we were fending off invasions from afar. And the Central Europe and the West was sort of protected in that way. They don't have these great historical battles, these clashes of civilization. They have them with their neighbor countries, but it's not really a clash of civilizations there. That's more ethnic groups and tribes. Here in the Balkans, a big reason why there's so much conflict is exactly the multiculturalism, because there's a clash of civilizations going on here perpetually. Way back it was the Ottoman Empire, and then from the Russian side there were further back than the Ottoman Empire there were the Mongols, the Golden Horde. And we've been fending these other alien civilizations off for forever, and they're different. It's a different faith, Islam, the great enemy of European civilization. And we have these in history class. We learn of the great battles that were fought by the underdogs of the Balkans, tiny countries up against the giant Ottoman Empire and the giant Mongol hold, And we have a sense of, we know what our ancestors went through. And currently in the West, the leaders there, and not even just there, in the East too, in some states, less so than the West, the leaders don't care about history anymore. And in general, people don't even really read that many books anymore. And it's also a problem of the system right now, where money, the free market demands more labor. So let's import millions and millions of completely culturally and racially alien people into the continent, just so we can have more fancy gadgets. I am sure nothing can go wrong here.
Yeah, it is quite potent, that parallel between what happened in the what caused the first war, and then what's being done to our societies again through mass migration and multiculturalism, which it just doesn't demonstrate that anybody has learned anything. And Darth, do you agree that the fact that they're pursuing this multicultural agenda is a clear lack of historical knowledge about what causes conflict in human history?
Absolutely. I find nothing more fascinating than exploring, historical past. But I think we as a society like to think that we are far more intellectually advanced than our forefathers. But clearly, if we're doing exactly the same things which what they did, and advocating that they are good ideas when it's clearly shown not to be good ideas, then it shows that we have learned nothing. So either there's a willful ignorance with making the decisions that our leaders are making, or there is just a lack of education. And I think there is a definite attempt in certain societies to erase history. I mean, again, I'm going back to the US here, but there's the people are advocating to remove the statues of the Civil War, or to remove certain parts of history because it offends people. But as soon as you do that, you risk repeating what people fought and died for. These ideals, you risk repeating those ideals because you don't actually know why they happened and why they were bad. So with World War One, what I find quite worrying is the war was initially fought between European brothers who largely had similar views and similar beliefs. They were all pretty much Christian countries. But what I worry about now is with the increase in multiculturalism of the European continent, I worry that it's going to be a far more bloody and widespread conflict if another one breaks out, because we are vastly losing our identities, if that makes any sense whatsoever.
Yeah, just to jump in here quickly, to sort of frame it in a way, just to give people a perspective on this. In Europe, we fought 2 world wars, and they're called world wars because they were the bloodiest and most large-scale conflicts of the world ever. And those 2 wars were both times fought between, essentially it was a civil war, yeah, between brothers who, vast majority of them were Christian, 99%, and shared history, shared culture, shared civilization, shared languages, shared language trees, shared history, shared memories, everything. We're very similar. We're diverse, but we're very similar. But what will happen now with the importation of completely alien elements? So just think about it. 2 world wars, bloodiest conflicts ever, tens of millions murdered, destroyed in total war, civilians, soldiers, everything was fair game. And that was between very similar people. What will happen when completely alien cultures are there? It will be much, much worse.
You summed it up better than I could.
Well, yeah, it's totally true, and it's an important point that people should understand, is that if close cultural, linguistic, and ethnic neighbours can do to each other what happened in the First World War, I don't know what people think that radically different groups will do to each other, because the conflict, the level of conflict will always increase directly in correlation with the level of difference between people, because difference and conflict are essentially synonymous in human history. So it's an important lesson that that our leaders clearly haven't learned. I just want to move on to the final thing we were going to talk about, which is, and I think a lot of people are interested in this, is the sheer futility of war. I've got a little point I want to share with you guys in a bit about this, but just first of all, I mean, I can't see it. I can't see any gains that were made in the First World War. Do you think that there's a case to say to people, look, we need to make sure that we avert another similar situation, because even the victors of World War One lost effectively. They made net losses. So, I mean, do you guys agree that actually even the victors got, and definitely the losers, got nothing good out of the First World War?
Definitely. Basically all the economic gains that were made by all European countries, all the former empires in the, what was it, maybe even 2 centuries, but I think it was the century leading up to the First War. All of that accumulated wealth of all the empires in a century was lost in 4 years of total warfare. Just sit with those words and think about that for a moment.
Yeah, just on that, I think Britain at the start of the war was the richest country or richest empire in the world. And by the end of the war, they were dead broke. And I think they were effectively paying for, the Russian movement. They were paying partially for France's war movement. And by the end of the war, they were effectively having to buy in credit from the USA to keep the war fund going, because they had effectively ran out of hard cash. So they were having to buy in credit. And like you said, the entire wealth of Europe was literally sucked out of the continent because of a futile war. The only thing that I can say that is good that has come out of the war potentially, and there's an argument for both ways. I mean, I would say more so it's obvious in during the Cold War was the advancement of technology. I think technology advances far quicker during conflict periods than during peaceful periods. Now, right now, you could argue that that's not the case in the last kind of couple of decades with the computer age. Technology is advancing exponentially. But the other thing that I was going to say, and this is only something I heard in about the last year or so, I think it was one of the German generals or German kind of philosophers. I want to say it was von Moltke Senior. He advocated that war was essential. That when you had long periods of peace, people would effectively fall into laziness. Consumerism would take over. Everybody would lose focus on what the important things were in life. You would stop caring about your neighbor. You would stop caring about things. And he argued that war brought out the best in man. All the things that people would say was good about war, and mankind performed amazingly during that time. Take from that what you will. But I think right now, one of the reasons why we are so prone to infighting amongst ourselves is because we don't have a common enemy. I think the reason why the USA was united during the Cold War period was because they had somebody to focus to fight on. During World War II, people had a united enemy to fight, whether or not you believe that they were right to fight against them or not. And I think right now we don't really have, in the West, have a threat to our existence in the same way that we did during the 20th century. And therefore, it's much easier for us to fight amongst each other, with political correctness, with mass migration, all these things that would not have been viewed upon as problems before are now, because there isn't the possibility of a conflict that's going to break out again, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think it's a valid point that obviously, we're not really pacifists here, so there is an argument. I want to say this in the right way, but there is an argument for war. Not all wars are wrong, and like you said, you do get things out of war, like an advance in technology and certain gains depending on what the war is. And I think the quote or the source you mentioned about war bringing out the best in people, I think that's certainly true, because there's some great stories of heroism from the First World War. Countless hundreds of thousands of acts of valor and bravery that we wouldn't have otherwise seen, and maybe that the people in question wouldn't have otherwise displayed. So on a moral level, it's not all lost. And before I finish up on that, sorry, Darth, you say what you were going to say, and then Boris, I think you had something afterwards.
Yep, sure.
It came back into my head. I was going to say earlier on, I think it would be interesting to see what our generation would look like, or how it would react if it was expected to fight in a war like World War One. I just can't see our generation or the generation below us, or possibly even above us, fighting a war like World War One in the trenches, day after day after day, on the edge, expecting to die, expecting not to make it home, writing to your loved ones like it's the last time you're ever going to communicate with them. I just don't think our generation could do it. I just don't think we have the mental strength now, because there's this victim complex in society now where everybody's a victim, and your rights are more important than your responsibilities. And I just can't see our society, our countries fighting another war, because I don't think we're capable of it mentally.
Yeah, and well, everything you just said, this is why I'm an advocate of military service for young people. I'd practically make it mandatory, to play devil's advocate, I guess, for a moment here. One country that keeps the importance of history in perspective, especially with its young, is Israel, for example. They have mandatory military duty for, I think, a year for everyone in the country, and they have massive reserves of people who are currently civilians, but they can be called upon at any time. And to bring it to World War One and to Europe, when you are there in the military, you not only build bonds with your fellow volunteers and the people there, but you learn the history of your tribe, of your nation, and that's why history is so important. The world would be a better place if people just knew history better. They would see everything. There are so many cycles. Things repeat themselves. And if just reading history, you forget about feelings, and you just realize human nature. And yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And so I think, to conclude it, really, the point here is that there is a case to be made for military service, a strong military tradition, and even war. But also, I think what you're talking about with the cyclical view of history is that we need to learn and be better equipped to deal with the challenges that the inevitable will throw at us. But no, I think we've had a good discussion on this today, and I hope our listeners will agree, because we've covered some important points.
William, I think you had a point earlier on that would summarise how futile the First World War was.
That's right. Yeah, I did.
Yeah.
And this really does bring it home to people. So I hope this will have the gravitas that it does in my head, which is that, and this is a true story, that the first British soldier to die in the First World War and the last British soldier to die in the First World War, 4 years apart, after hundreds of thousands of deaths in between, they're buried within 10 yards of one another on the same Belgian battlefield, which really does put into contrast how little was achieved. The battlefield it hardly moved over 4 years. So at the end of it, this is an example of an extremely futile war that achieved nothing and that everybody lost. So I think for the listeners, it's such an important lesson that we've just got to learn. But yeah, and I hope you guys have enjoyed the discussion generally. Before we finish up and sign off completely, I just want to hand over any quick remarks for either of you that you want to make on the topics.
Yeah, I think on a if you're to look at the First World War as a whole, I don't think you can collectively draw any positives out of it. I think if you kind of highlight things, like I said earlier on, technology advancements, then yes, you can argue, okay, there was some benefits, but does the cost outweigh the benefits or vice versa? So, I mean, the First World War was not the most costly war in history, but there's a reason why it was called the Great War, because, up to that point, it was death on an unimaginable scale, on an industrial scale. And it showed humanity what the advancement of technology would do towards war. And I think what I would draw from that is nobody was prepared for how people would be killed and how fast they would be killed. And I think if we have the same kind of outbreak of war today, nobody's going to be prepared for the grand scale of things. The difference between World War I and World War II was 20 or so years. There was advancements in technology, but I think it would be safe to say that it was still very much a similar style of war. The mechanization was apparent, but it wasn't as obvious as people seem to think. Whereas today, if you have the same kind of war breakout, it's not even going to be close. I think it would dwarf what World War I and World War II look like together, if we had a conflict on the same scale.
Definitely. The only thing I would add to that is just the phrase "history is the teacher of life" it's true. It's basically true, and everyone, to the listeners, just always try to learn more about history, especially your history, your people's history, your continent's history, the conflicts that you went through, the mistakes, the trials, what your ancestors went through to get you, their descendants, to where you are now. And yeah, just read more.
Yeah, I think both very important points, and we would all learn a lot more about the present and the future if we looked to the past. So yeah, once again, thanks for joining me on this one today, guys, Boris and Darth, and hope you listeners enjoyed it. Like I said at the beginning, if you want to go back and look at previous episodes, then they're all out there for you to do so. And of course, if you'd like to help us keep doing what we're doing and bringing you good content on the website and on the podcast, then the links are in the description below to donate. Thank you very much if you do. And that's all from us.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Cheers, guys.